I still remember the night clearly, not because anything dramatic happened right away, but because of how ordinary it felt at the start. Some nights change your life quietly, without warning, and only later do you realize you crossed a line you can never uncross. It was my cousin Ryan who invited me. He called me late in the afternoon, his voice full of that careless energy he'd always had. Ryan was the kind of guy who collected people easily. Friend from work, friend from the gym, friends he'd met once and somehow kept forever. I was the opposite. I kept my circle small, my emotions even smaller. Come out with me tonight, he said. There's a party. Nothing wild. Just people, music, drinks. I almost said no. I usually did. Mark and I had fallen into a routine that didn't leave much room for late nights or spontaneous plans. We'd been together for 3 years, long enough to know each other's habits, long enough to stop asking certain questions. Lately, we talked more about groceries and schedules than feelings. Still, saying no felt easier than explaining why I was tired all the time, even when I wasn't doing much. Ryan mentioned his friend was coming too. Lucas, he said casually, like the name didn't matter. You'll like him. I didn't think anything of it. I wasn't looking for anything. That's the truth, even if it sounds like something people say to excuse what comes next. I told Mark I was going out with Ryan, kissed him on the cheek, and promised I wouldn't be late. He smiled, distracted, already half absorbed in something on his phone. The party was in an apartment downtown, the kind with exposed brick and large windows that reflected the city lights. Music floated through the rooms, not too loud, just enough to blur conversations together. People laughed easily, holding red cups, leaning against counters like they belonged there. I felt like a guest in someone else's life, hovering at the edges. Ryan disappeared almost immediately, pulled into conversations like gravity didn't apply to him. I stood near the kitchen, pretending to study a framed poster on the wall, when someone spoke beside me. You look like you're deciding whether to stay or escape. I turned and saw Lucas for the first time. He wasn't flashy. No dramatic entrance, no loud confidence. He had a calm presence, steady eyes, and a small, knowing smile. The kind of person who made you feel like slowing down. Is it that obvious? I asked. A little, he said. Not unkindly, we talked about simple things at first, where we worked, how we knew Ryan, how crowded the city had become. His voice was even thoughtful. He listened more than he spoke, and when he did speak, it felt intentional, like he chose his words carefully. I found myself relaxing without meaning to. At one point, the music changed and laughter burst from the living room. Lucas glanced over, then back at me. You okay here? He asked, as if he'd noticed I was holding myself a little too tightly. Yeah, I said. I just don't come to things like this much anymore. Me neither, he replied. But sometimes it's good to remind yourself you still exist outside your routine. That line stayed with me. It shouldn't have meant anything, but it did. Because lately, I'd felt invisible in my own life, like I was playing a role I'd already memorized that I thought about Mark then. About how he hadn't asked who would be there, or how long I'd stay. About how I hadn't told him much either. The thought made my chest tighten, and I shifted my weight, creating a small physical distance between Lucas and me. Lucas noticed. He always seemed to notice. He didn't step closer. He didn't push. He just nodded slightly, as if he understood something I hadn't said out loud. As the night went on, people drifted in and out of conversations. Ryan checked in once, grinning, clearly happy I'd stayed. Lucas and I ended up sitting on opposite ends of the couch, talking about childhood memories, about how strange it was to grow into someone your younger self wouldn't recognize. I laughed more than I expected to. I felt lighter, and that scared me. Because comfort can be dangerous when it comes from the wrong place at the wrong time. To some point, I realized I hadn't checked my phone in a while. A small sense of guilt settled in my stomach, quiet but persistent. I told myself it was nothing, just a conversation, just a party. But as I looked at Lucas, listening intently as he spoke, I had a sudden, unsettling thought. Something had begun. Not an action, not a decision, but a feeling. And I knew enough about myself to know that once a feeling takes root, pretending it doesn't exist is its own kind of lie. That was the moment the night changed for me. long before anything actually happened. The party slowly thinned out as the night went on. People said their goodbyes in clusters, promises to text that everyone knew would probably fade by morning. Empty cups gathered on the counter, and the music dropped to a softer volume, like it too was getting tired. I checked the time and told myself I should leave soon. I even stood up once, ready to find Ryan and say my goodbyes. But then Lucas spoke again, and I sat back down that we'd moved closer without realizing it. Not close enough to touch, but close enough to feel each other's presence. Our conversation drifted from light topics into quieter territory. Regrets we didn't usually admit. Moments we wished we'd handled differently. It wasn't dramatic. It was honest in a way that felt rare. I sometimes wonder, Lucas said, staring at the floor instead of at me, how many versions of ourselves we don't become just because of timing. I knew what he meant immediately. Timing had shaped my life more than I liked to admit. Meeting Mark when I did. Choosing comfort when uncertainty felt too risky. Staying silent when speaking up might have changed everything. I nodded slowly. Timing can be cruel, I said, or convenient. Depends on how you look at it. Lucas smiled faintly. I guess I'm still figuring out which one it's been for me. There was a pause after that, not awkward, just full. The kind of silence that invites honesty if you're not careful. I felt an urge to say something personal, something real, and that urge frightened me. I cleared my throat. So how do you know Ryan? I asked, steering us back to safer ground. He laughed softly, recognizing the detour, but not calling it out. We worked together a few years ago. He's been dragging me to social events ever since. Says I need to get out more. Sounds like him, I said, and as the night deepened, the apartment felt different. Quieter, warmer, like a shared secret. Ryan was in the kitchen, talking animatedly to someone, completely unaware of the shift happening a few feet away from him. Lucas leaned back against the couch. Can I ask you something? He said. Sure. Are you seeing someone? The question landed heavier than it should have. Not because it was unexpected, but because I've been avoiding it myself all night. For a moment, I considered giving a vague answer. Something half-true, something safe, but Lucas was looking at me with a kind of openness that made lying feel wrong. Yes, I said. I have a boyfriend. Mark. Lucas didn't react the way I feared he might. No disappointment that spilled over into bitterness. No sudden distance. He just nodded once, absorbing the information. Thank you for telling me, he said quietly. That I exhaled, not realizing I'd been holding my breath. I should have said it earlier. Maybe, he replied, but I get why you didn't. That understanding cut deeper than judgment would have, because it meant he saw me, flaws and all, and still chose kindness. That we both sat there, the truth settling between us. I expected the moment to end the connection, to snap it cleanly in two. Instead, it transformed it into something more complicated. The feelings didn't disappear just because they were named. I don't want to cross any lines, Lucas said after a moment. I respect that you're with someone. I know, I said quickly, and I don't want that either. But even as I said it, I knew how fragile those words were. Wanting and choosing are not always the same thing. Outside, the city hummed faintly through an open window. Somewhere, a car horn sounded distant and lonely. Ryan laughed loudly in the kitchen, his voice echoing through the apartment. Lucas stood up. I should probably head out, he said, before things get confusing. Part of me felt relieved. Another part felt an unexpected sting of loss. I stood as well, following him toward the door. We stopped there, facing each other under the dim hallway light. I'm glad I met you, he said. Me too, I replied before I could stop myself. For a second, neither of us moved. No touch, no dramatic gesture. Just two people standing in a moment that asked a question neither of us answered out loud. Then Lucas stepped back, creating space where there hadn't been any. Take care, Ethan. You too, I said. After he left, the apartment felt emptier than it should have. I said goodbye to Ryan, made an excuse about being tired, and stepped out into the cool night air. The walk home felt longer than usual. My phone buzzed with a message from Mark asking if I was on my way. Yes, I typed back. Leaving now. It was the truth. But it wasn't the whole truth. That as I walked, Lucas's words replayed in my mind. The ease of our conversation. The feeling of being understood without having to explain myself. I told myself it would fade by morning, that it was just a momentary connection, nothing more, but deep down, I knew something had shifted. Not because of what we did, but because of what we felt. And that realization followed me all the way home, quiet and persistent, like a shadow I couldn't outrun. The days after the party moved more slowly than I expected. Nothing in my routine changed on the surface. I still woke up early, still went to work, still came home to Mark and asked about his day. But underneath all of that, something restless had taken hold of me. It was there in the pauses between conversations, in the way my thoughts drifted when I should have been listening. Mark noticed before he said anything. He always did. He asked if I was tired, if work was stressing me out. I told him I was fine. I smiled when I said it, hoping that would make it true. But the smile felt borrowed, like I was wearing someone else's expression. Point one evening, as we sat on opposite ends of the couch, Mark reached for my hand. The gesture was familiar, comforting. It should have been enough. Instead, a sharp wave of guilt washed over me, so sudden it almost made me pull away. I didn't, but the moment lingered longer than it should have. That night, after Mark fell asleep, I lay awake staring at the ceiling. My phone rested on the nightstand, screen dark. I hadn't given Lucas my number. I hadn't asked for his. There was no secret thread tying us together, no messages waiting to be discovered. And yet, he was there in my thoughts as clearly as if we'd spoken that day. I told myself I hadn't done anything wrong. No rules have been broken. No promises shattered. But honesty isn't just about actions. It's about intent. And I couldn't deny that part of me had leaned towards something I knew I shouldn't want. A few days later, Ryan texted me. Just checking in, he said. Asked if I'd made it home okay that night. Then, casually, almost as an afterthought, he mentioned Lucas. Said he'd asked about me. Nothing dramatic. Just curiosity that I stared at the message longer than necessary. My heart beat a little faster, and I hated that it did. I typed a neutral response, something polite and non-committal, then set the phone down and walked away from it like it might burn me. That was when I realized the real problem wasn't Lucas. It was the space inside me that had been ready to receive him. A week passed. Then another. Life continued, relentless and ordinary. Mark and I talked more, trying, in our own awkward way, to reconnect. We went out to dinner one night, shared a bottle of wine, laughed an old memory. For a moment, I felt hopeful. Maybe the party had been a wake-up call, not a mistake. But late that night, Mark asked me something I hadn't prepared for. Are you happy? He said, not accusing, just tired. The question hung between us, heavy and unavoidable. I want to say yes. I wanted to mean it. Instead, I hesitated, and that hesitation said more than any words could have. I don't know. I admitted quietly. Mark nodded, eyes fixed on the floor. I've been feeling that too, he said. I just didn't know how to say it. There it was. The truth we'd both been circling, finally spoken. We talked for hours after that, not fighting, not blaming, just laying out what we'd been avoiding for a long time. By the end of the conversation, nothing was resolved, but something was clear. Whatever we were holding onto was already changing. In the days that followed, I thought again about Lucas. Not as an escape, not as a fantasy, but as a mirror. He hadn't created my doubts. He'd simply reflected them back to me. I never saw him again. Ryan mentioned him once or twice in passing, and each time, I felt a familiar mix of warmth and restraint. Some connections are meant to remain unfinished, meaningful because of what they reveal rather than what they become. Mark and I eventually chose to step back from each other, not in anger, not with dramatic endings, but with a quiet understanding that love without honesty slowly turns into something else, something heavier. Looking back now, I don't think about that night as a betrayal in the traditional sense. I think of it as a moment when I became aware of a truth I could no longer ignore. Infidelity doesn't always begin with touch or secrecy. Sometimes it begins with realizing your heart is already somewhere it hasn't admitted yet. That realization changed me. It taught me that avoiding hard conversations doesn't protect anyone. It just delays the moment when the truth finally demands to be heard. And when it does, it's always better to face it fully, even if it means letting go. After Mark and I decided to step back, the apartment felt unfamiliar, like a place I was visiting rather than living in. We were still kind to each other, still careful, but the air between us had changed. Conversations became shorter, more practical. We talked about logistics instead of feelings, as if emotions were fragile objects we didn't trust ourselves to handle anymore. That I moved out a week later, taking only what I needed at first. Clothes, a few books, the framed photo from a trip we'd taken years ago that I couldn't quite bring myself to leave behind. When I closed the door for the last time, there was no dramatic goodbye. Just a quiet understanding that something meaningful had ended without needing to be destroyed. Living alone again took some adjustment. The silence was louder than I expected. There were evenings when I cooked dinner for one and realized I'd made too much out of habit. Moments when I reached for my phone to tell Mark something small and ordinary, only to remember I no longer could. Those were the moments that hurt the most, not the big realizations, but the tiny absences. Ryan checked in often. He asked how I was holding up, offered to come over, suggested distractions. I appreciated it, even when I said no. One night, over coffee, he mentioned Lucas again, more carefully this time. He didn't pry, just said Lucas had moved to a different part of the city and seemed happy. That I felt a strange sense of relief hearing that. Not because I've been waiting for something, but because it confirmed what I already knew. That chapter was complete, even if it had never fully opened. There were nights when I replayed the party in my mind, wondering what would have happened if I'd made different choices. If I'd been more honest sooner. If I'd stayed home. If I talked to Mark months earlier instead of letting distance grow quietly between us. Those thoughts didn't lead anywhere productive, but they were part of the process. You can't heal from something without first acknowledging it. Over time, I started to see the situation more clearly. The infidelity wasn't a single moment or person. It was a slow drifting away from myself, from my own needs and truths. Lucas had simply been the moment I noticed the distance, that I began focusing on myself in ways I hadn't in years. Therapy helped. So did long walks through the city, letting my thoughts settle instead of chasing distractions. I reconnected with old friends, the ones who knew me before I became careful and quiet. I learned to sit with discomfort instead of avoiding it. One evening, months later, I ran into Mark by chance at a grocery store. We stood awkwardly in the produce aisle, both reaching for the same bag of apples before laughing softly and stepping back. We talked for a few minutes, genuinely. He looked lighter somehow. So did I. I think we did the right thing, he said before we parted. I nodded. I think so too. Walking home after that, I realized something important. Growth doesn't always come from dramatic mistakes or big turning points. Sometimes, it comes from small moments that force you to listen to what you've been ignoring. The party, the conversation, the feeling I couldn't name at first. They were all signals, not sins. That I don't tell this story because I'm proud of every choice I made. I tell it because it taught me how easily honesty can slip away when comfort takes its place, and how necessary it is to reclaim it before it's too late. Some nights still remind me of that apartment downtown, the low music, the quiet understanding in a stranger's eyes. But those memories no longer pull at me. They sit where they belong, in the past, as part of the story that helped me become more honest with myself. And that, in the end, is what stayed with me most. Not the temptation, not the guilt, but the lesson that loving someone, yourself included, requires courage, clarity, and the willingness to face the truth before it quietly changes everything. Time has a way of softening memories without erasing their meaning. Months passed, and the intensity of what I felt slowly settled into something quieter, something I could carry without pain. Life moved forward, and so did I. I focused on my studies, my goals, and the small moments that reminded me who I was becoming. The experience with Daniel no longer felt like an open wound, but like a chapter that had taught me something important. Eventually, I heard from Daniel again. It wasn't unexpected, but it wasn't sudden either. His message was brief and thoughtful, checking in and wishing me well. There was no hint of unresolved emotion, only kindness and respect. I replied in the same tone, grateful that we could acknowledge each other without reopening old feelings. That exchange felt like closure in the truest sense. Not long after, I visited my family. Sitting across from my father at the dinner table, listening to his stories and laughter, I felt a deep sense of clarity. I understood more clearly than ever how important trust and honesty are, not just in actions, but in intentions. I didn't share my story with him. It wasn't necessary. What mattered was that I had learned to honor the relationships in my life by respecting their boundaries. As I continued to explore my identity, I did so with more confidence. The confusion I once felt had given way to acceptance. I learned that understanding who you are doesn't happen all at once. It unfolds through experiences, reflection, and sometimes difficult choices. That weekend had been one of those defining moments for me that I also came to understand that love, in its healthiest form, never asks you to compromise your values. What I felt wasn't wrong in itself, but acting on it would have caused harm. Recognizing that difference was a sign of growth I hadn't expected for myself, in time, I met new people. Connections build on openness and equality, without secrecy or imbalance. Those relationships felt different, lighter, because they were rooted in honesty from the start. I carried the lessons from the past with me, using them to guide my choices rather than weigh me down. Looking back now, I don't regret that weekend. I respect it for what it was, a moment of emotional awakening that taught me about responsibility, restraint, and self-respect. It showed me that sometimes the bravest thing you can do is step away. Even when feelings are real, that if there's one truth I've learned, it's that growth often comes from choosing what's right over what's easy. My story isn't about scandal or secrets. It's about learning to navigate emotions with integrity. And in doing so, I found a stronger, more honest version of myself. That's why I share this story now, not to dwell on the past, but to acknowledge how it shaped me. Some connections are meant to teach us, not stay with us forever. And sometimes, letting go is the very thing that allows us to move forward with peace.